in the humid lowlands of coastal Georgia, where the Ojiji River wound through rice plantations that produced fortunes built on the backs of enslaved labor, where the summer heat could kill a field hand in hours, and the mosquitoes carried fevers that decimated entire communities. There exists a story that medical historians have debated for decades, a case that challenges every assumption about the boundaries of scientific inquiry, the nature of marriage in the antebellum South, and the depths of depravity that could be rationalized under the guise of research. The Whitfield plantation, located 15 miles south of Savannah, was a modest operation by the standards of coastal Georgia elite, with 800 acres dedicated primarily to rice cultivation and a population of 43 enslaved people who worked the fields and maintained the property. What distinguished the Whitfield plantation from hundreds of similar operations was not its agricultural output, but rather the experiments conducted by its owner, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a physician and self-taught naturalist who had become obsessed with questions of heredity, racial characteristics, and what he believed was the scientific study of human breeding. Between 1847 and 1855, Dr. Whitfield conducted a systematic program of forced reproduction involving his wife Eleanor and 4 enslaved men, documenting every aspect of these pregnancies and the resulting children in detailed journals that read like a nightmarish fusion of medical research and pornographic fantasy, clinical observation and sadistic exploitation. What these journals revealed, when they were discovered in a locked trunk after Dr. Whitfield's death in 1871, was a marriage that had been transformed into a laboratory, a household where the normal boundaries between husband and wife, master and slave, researcher and subject had been completely obliterated in service of what Whitfield believed was groundbreaking scientific inquiry into the nature of racial mixing and the inheritance of physical and mental characteristics. This is the story of Marcus and Eleanor Whitfield, of how scientific racism and absolute power over enslaved people could combine to create a domestic situation that violated every moral principle while being meticulously documented as if it were legitimate research, and of 4 children who were born into an impossible situation, products of a system that allowed one man to treat both his wife and his human property as experimental subjects in a study that served no purpose beyond satisfying his own twisted curiosity and desire for control. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. Marcus Whitfield was born in 1812 in Charleston, South Carolina, the son of a successful cotton factor who had made a fortune brokering deals between planters and northern textile mills. He received his medical education at the Medical College of South Carolina, graduating in 1835 with a reputation as a brilliant but socially awkward student who showed more interest in laboratory work and anatomical study than in the interpersonal aspects of medical practice. After completing his degree, Marcus had spent 3 years working as a ship's surgeon on vessels trading between Charleston and Caribbean ports, an experience that exposed him to diverse populations and apparently sparked his interest in what 19th century science called racial characteristics. By 1838, Marcus had returned to the American South and established a small medical practice in Savannah, catering primarily to the families of wealthy planters who valued his education and scientific approach, even as they found his manner cold and his bedside manner lacking. In 1840, Marcus married Eleanor Hayes, the 18-year-old daughter of a declining planter family from the South Carolina Lowcountry. The marriage had been arranged by their respective families, with Eleanor's father seeing the union as securing his daughter's future with an educated professional, while Marcus's father saw it as providing his socially isolated son with the respectability that marriage to an established family could bring. Eleanor was described by contemporaries as quiet, bookish, and unsuited to the social demands of plantation mistress, characteristics that made her an outsider in the elite circles of Savannah society, but apparently suited Marcus's purposes. The couple moved to the Whitfield plantation in 1842 after Marcus purchased the property using an inheritance from his father, with Marcus announcing his intention to combine medical practice with agricultural management and scientific research. The plantation house was a modest two-story structure, comfortable but not ostentatious, surrounded by the rice fields that generated the property's income and the slave quarters that housed the 43 enslaved people whose labor made the operation possible. Marcus established a medical office in the house where he saw patients from the surrounding area, though his practice was never large or lucrative. Most of his time being devoted to what he called his research into heredity and racial characteristics. This research, in its early phases, consisted primarily of detailed physical measurements and observations of the enslaved people on his property, recordings of height, weight, skin color, hair texture, facial features, and various other characteristics that 19th-century racial science considered significant. Marcus kept meticulous records of families among his enslaved population, tracking which children inherited which characteristics from their parents, attempting to discern patterns in the transmission of physical traits across generations. This work was not unusual for the time. Many educated men in the antebellum South dabbled in racial science, seeking to provide scientific justification for slavery by arguing that black and white people represented fundamentally different types of humanity with distinct and inherited characteristics. What made Marcus's research distinctive was its increasing focus on what he called controlled breeding experiments, attempts to systematically produce offspring with specific parental combinations to test his theories about racial inheritance. By 1845, Marcus had begun arranging marriages among his enslaved population based on his research interests, pairing individuals with particular characteristics to see what traits their children would display, documenting the results with the same clinical detachment he applied to all his observations. These forced pairings were not unusual in plantation management. Many slaveholders arranged marriages among their enslaved people to produce children who would increase the property's human capital. But Marcus's approach was more systematic and explicitly experimental than the typical practice. The transformation of this research to involve Eleanor began in 1846. According to entries in Marcus's journal discovered after his death, he had become increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the limitations of his research. He could observe the offspring of enslaved parents and note patterns of inheritance, but he couldn't control for all the variables he considered important. He couldn't be certain of paternity in all cases, and he couldn't conduct the kind of systematic comparisons he believed were necessary for truly scientific conclusions. At some point during 1846, Marcus conceived the idea that would define the next decade of the Whitfield household. He would conduct his breeding experiments using Eleanor as the mother, ensuring maternal consistency while varying the fathers, and he would use enslaved men from his property as the fathers, allowing him to test his theories about racial mixing and inheritance under controlled conditions. How Marcus convinced Eleanor to participate in this arrangement remains unclear, as Eleanor left no written record of her thoughts or feelings, her voice existing only as filtered through Marcus's clinical observations and the few accounts from people who knew the family. Marcus's journal suggests that he presented the plan to Eleanor as a form of scientific collaboration, emphasizing the importance of the research and framing her participation as a contribution to human knowledge. He apparently assured her that the arrangements would be conducted with medical supervision, that her reputation would be protected by the isolation of the plantation and careful management of information, and that the children produced would be cared for appropriately. Whether Eleanor consented to this arrangement in any meaningful sense, given the complete legal and social power Marcus held over her as her husband, remains one of the many disturbing questions raised by this case. Under Georgia law of the time, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband, no right to refuse sexual relations, no control over her own body or reproductive capacity, making the distinction between consent and coercion functionally meaningless in the context of this marriage. The first pregnancy began in early 1847, with Marcus selecting a 25-year-old enslaved man named Samuel as the father. Samuel was a skilled carpenter who Marcus had purchased specifically for this purpose, chosen because of his physical characteristics which Marcus considered representative of what he called pure African type. And because Samuel's own parents had been directly imported from West Africa, making him what was termed in the slave trade as African-born. Marcus's journals describe the process of arranging the pregnancy with clinical precision, detailing how he supervised the encounters between Eleanor and Samuel over a period of several weeks, how he calculated Eleanor's fertile periods based on medical knowledge of the time, and how he documented every aspect of the pregnancy once conception was confirmed. Eleanor's first pregnancy proceeded normally, though Marcus noted various physical changes and symptoms with the same detached observation he applied to all his research. The child, a boy, was born in December 1847, and Marcus immediately began his observations of the infant's physical characteristics, measuring every aspect of the baby's appearance, comparing features to both Eleanor and Samuel, attempting to determine which traits came from which parent. The child was named Marcus Jr., though Marcus's journals refer to him primarily by a numbered designation as Subject 1, treating his own ostensible son as a specimen in an ongoing experiment. The legal and social status of this child was complicated and carefully managed. Marcus registered the birth as his legitimate son, though he privately noted in his journals that Samuel was the biological father, and he raised the child in the plantation house as part of the White family. Despite the child's mixed-race ancestry being obvious to anyone who saw him. The second pregnancy, involving a different enslaved father, began in 1849. Marcus selected a 22-year-old man named Thomas, whose parents had both been of mixed-race ancestry, what the slave system classified as mulatto, making Thomas approximately 1/4 African by Marcus's racial calculations. The process followed the same pattern as the first pregnancy, with Marcus supervising encounters between Eleanor and Thomas, documenting the pregnancy, and conducting detailed observations of the resulting child, a girl born in April 1850, who was named Catherine. Marcus's journals note differences between this child and the first, documenting skin color, hair texture, facial features, and various other characteristics he considered racially significant, attempting to correlate these traits with the different ancestries of the two fathers. The third pregnancy, beginning in 1851, involved an enslaved man named Benjamin, who was 28 years old and of predominantly European ancestry, classified in plantation records as nearly white, despite his legal status as enslaved. Benjamin's mother had been a mixed-race enslaved woman, while his father was believed to be the previous owner of the plantation where Benjamin had been born, making Benjamin approximately 3/4 European by ancestry. The child from this pregnancy, another boy born in March 1852 and named Robert, had features that were almost indistinguishable from those of white children, though he remained legally classified as Eleanor's son and raised in the plantation house. The fourth and final pregnancy in Marcus's documented experiments began in 1854, involving a 30-year-old enslaved man named Isaac, whose ancestry Marcus described as mixed African and Native American, with Isaac's mother having been Cherokee and his father having been of African ancestry. The child from this pregnancy, a girl born in February 1855 and named Susan, completed what Marcus considered a comprehensive set of data points, testing his theories about racial mixing and the inheritance of characteristics. Throughout these years from 1847 to 1855, Marcus maintained detailed journals documenting every aspect of his experiments. These journals, running to over 800 pages of closely written text, included clinical observations of Eleanor's pregnancies, detailed measurements and descriptions of the 4 children as they grew, comparisons of their physical and mental characteristics, speculations about patterns of racial inheritance, and Marcus's theories about what his observations revealed about human heredity. The journals also included disturbing passages describing Marcus's supervision of the encounters between Eleanor and the enslaved man, written in language that combined medical terminology with voyeuristic detail, suggesting that Marcus derived some form of satisfaction from observing and controlling these intimate acts beyond what could be justified by scientific purpose. The journals revealed that Marcus had developed increasingly specific theories about racial inheritance based on his observations. Theories that attempted to quantify how different proportions of African, European, and Native American ancestry produced different combinations of physical characteristics. Theories that he believed represented groundbreaking contributions to the science of his time. The psychological and emotional impact of these arrangements on Eleanor is difficult to determine from the historical record, as most of what exists comes from Marcus's perspective, and Eleanor left almost no direct testimony about her experiences. Marcus's journals include occasional notes about Eleanor's emotional state, describing periods of melancholy resistance and what he termed hysteria that required medical intervention, suggesting that Eleanor struggled profoundly with what was being done to her, even as she complied with Marcus's demands. The few contemporaneous accounts from people who visited the Whitfield plantation during this period describe Eleanor as withdrawn and nervous, uncomfortable in social situations, and displaying what would now be recognized as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. Whether Eleanor felt any attachment to the children she bore, whether she experienced the arrangements with the enslaved men as rape or something more complicated given the context of her powerlessness within her marriage, whether she saw herself as victim or collaborator in Marcus's experiments, remain questions that can never be fully answered. The impact on the 4 enslaved men who served as fathers in these arrangements is even more difficult to determine, as they left no record at all and were referred to in Marcus's journals only by first name and physical descriptions, treated as variables in an experiment rather than as human beings with their own experiences and feelings. The power dynamics involved were absolute. Enslaved men had no ability to refuse demands from their owner, and the penalty for resistance could be sale, physical punishment, or death. Whether they experienced being forced to have sexual relations with their owner's wife as violation, as simply another form of exploitation in a system built on exploitation, or something more complex can only be imagined. Marcus's journals note that he provided small rewards to the men who cooperated, extra rations or lighter work assignments, treating them like animals being trained rather than human beings being coerced. The 4 children born from these arrangements grew up in a bizarre and complicated situation, raised in the plantation house as Eleanor's children and legally as Marcus's offspring, but visibly of mixed-race ancestry and known within the household and among the enslaved community to have been fathered by enslaved men. Marcus continued his observations of the children as they grew, documenting their physical development, attempting to assess their intellectual capabilities, noting which characteristics seemed to be inherited from which parent, all recorded with the same clinical detachment that characterized all his research. By 1855, when the 4th child was born, Marcus apparently considered his experimental program complete. His journals from this period indicate that he believed he had gathered sufficient data to publish his findings, though this publication never occurred during his lifetime. Marcus continued his medical practice and plantation management through the 1850s and into the 1860s, the Civil War disrupting but not destroying his operations, and he lived to see slavery abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865. In the post-war period, Marcus briefly attempted to continue his scientific work, now framing it as research into freed people rather than enslaved property, but he found little support in the chaotic Reconstruction environment and eventually abandoned his efforts. Marcus Whitfield died in 1871 at the age of 59 from complications of pneumonia, leaving the plantation to Eleanor and the 4 children who were legally his heirs. Eleanor survived until 1889, living quietly on what remained of the property after the economic devastation of the Civil War and Reconstruction, never speaking publicly about the experiments that had defined her middle years, taking her experiences and feelings to her grave. The 4 children, Marcus Jr., Catherine, Robert, and Susan, had varying fates in the complex racial landscape of the post-Civil War South. Marcus Jr., despite his obvious mixed-race ancestry, managed to pass as white, and eventually moved to Atlanta, where he lived as a businessman with apparently no public acknowledgement of his true ancestry. Catherine married a mixed-race man and lived in Savannah, comfortable enough with her racial identity to remain in the black community. Robert, whose nearly white appearance gave him options that his siblings lacked, also passed for white and moved to Charleston, where he became a merchant. Susan, the youngest, remained on the plantation property with Eleanor until her mother's death, then moved to Philadelphia, where she lived in the city's mixed-race community. Marcus's journals remained locked in a trunk in the plantation house after his death, apparently unknown to Eleanor and the children, until they were discovered in 1887 during an estate settlement after Eleanor's declining health forced a sale of the remaining property. The journals were examined by the lawyers handling the estate, who were shocked by their contents and unsure how to proceed with material that documented crimes that could no longer be prosecuted, but that revealed information that could destroy the reputations and lives of Eleanor and her children if made public. Use. The lawyers eventually decided to seal the journals and deposit them with the Georgia Historical Society, with instructions that they not be opened until 1920, giving time for everyone directly involved to die before the contents could become public knowledge. When the journals were finally opened in 1920, they created a scandal within historical and medical communities, revealing a case that seemed to epitomize the worst aspects of scientific racism, the abuse of power that slavery enabled, and the complete disregard for human dignity that could exist when people were treated as experimental subjects. Medical historians have debated the Whitfield case ever since, using it as an example of how science can be corrupted when divorced from ethical constraints, how the scientific method can be employed in service of deeply immoral purposes, and how the institution of slavery created conditions where such exploitation could occur with no possibility of accountability or justice. The case raises disturbing questions about the nature of consent in situations of absolute power imbalance, about whether Eleanor can be considered a victim given her complicity in arrangements that also victimized the enslaved men involved, about how to categorize crimes that were technically legal under the laws of the time, but that violated fundamental human rights, and about what responsibility the medical profession bore for providing intellectual frameworks that rationalized such exploitation. Modern analysis of Marcus's theories and observations reveals that they were based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about race and heredity, reflecting the pseudoscientific racial theories that were widespread in 19th-century American science, but that have been thoroughly discredited by modern genetics. Marcus's attempts to correlate physical characteristics with racial ancestry and to derive general laws of heredity from his small and poorly controlled experiments showed no understanding of actual genetic mechanisms, and his conclusions were driven more by his pre-existing racist beliefs than by objective observation of evidence. The case is now studied in medical ethics courses as an extreme example of research abuse, alongside other notorious cases like the Tuskegee syphilis study, demonstrating how marginalized people have been used as experimental subjects without consent, and how the veneer of scientific inquiry has been used to justify exploitation that served no legitimate research purpose. The descendants of the Whitfield children, whose existence and ancestry became known after the journals were opened, have had complicated relationships with this history. Some have embraced the story as part of their family heritage, acknowledging the terrible circumstances of their ancestors' births while claiming identity from their mixed ancestry. Others have rejected any connection to the Whitfield name and the experiments that created their family line, preferring to identify solely with their African or European ancestry and to forget the exploitation that brought their family into existence. The Whitfield plantation property, what remained of it after multiple sales and subdivisions, is now a mix of residential and agricultural use, with no marker indicating the dark history that occurred there in the 1840s and 1850s. The plantation house where Eleanor lived and bore her 4 children was torn down in the 1920s, with only a few foundation stones remaining to mark where it once stood. The graves of Marcus and Eleanor, in a small family cemetery on what was once the plantation property, have simple markers that give no indication of the experiments that defined their lives. The broader historical significance of the Whitfield case extends beyond the specific individuals involved. It reveals how the absolute power that slavery granted to owners over enslaved people could enable abuses that went far beyond the economic exploitation that was slavery's primary purpose. It demonstrates how racist pseudoscience could provide intellectual justification for treating human beings as experimental subjects. And it shows how the legal subordination of wives to husbands in 19th-century marriage law could create situations where women had no power to resist their husbands' demands, regardless of how those demands violated their bodily autonomy and human dignity. The case challenges comfortable assumptions about the antebellum South, showing that the horrors of slavery extended beyond the fields and the auction block to include exploitation hidden behind closed doors in plantation houses. Experiments conducted in the name of science, and abuses that remained secret for decades because the victims had no power to speak and society had no interest in listening. If this story revealed something you never knew about how slavery and scientific racism combined to enable exploitation that violated every principle of human dignity, leave a comment telling us what disturbed you most. And if you want more untold stories of medical abuses, the dark history of racial pseudoscience, and the ways that power can be used to treat human beings as property and experimental subjects, subscribe. These stories matter, not just as history, but as warnings about what can happen when science proceeds without ethical constraints, when some human beings are granted absolute power over others, and when society creates systems that deny basic rights and dignity to entire categories of people. They thought Dr. Marcus Whitfield was a respectable physician and scientific researcher, an educated professional pursuing legitimate questions about heredity and human variation. But the truth was that he had transformed his own household into a laboratory where both his wife and his enslaved property were treated as experimental subjects, where children were conceived not out of love or even simple exploitation, but as data points in a study that served no purpose beyond satisfying his twisted curiosity about racial mixing, and where the veneer of scientific inquiry concealed a decade of systematic abuse that remained hidden until long after everyone directly involved had died. And in those 800 pages of clinical observations and pseudoscientific theories that Marcus Whitfield left behind, in the careful measurements and detailed documentation of 4 children born under such terrible circumstances, there remains evidence not of scientific progress, but of how easily the language of research and the methods of observation can be employed to rationalize the worst forms of human exploitation. How absolute power, combined with racist ideology, can create situations where morality is completely subordinated to curiosity, and how the victims of such exploitation can be rendered voiceless by systems that refuse to recognize their suffering or grant them any means of seeking justice.